College football nerds here talking off-season content. That's right, multiple videos in the off-season. What is going on? And we're doing something a little different because it's off-season and we need something interesting and cool to talk about. And y'all have watched enough draft videos, so we are here to bring you something different. We're going to talk about 5 things that people got wrong or we got right or wrong in the 2020 season. We're going to revisit some of the big things, the big talking points. And Josh, the first one, that's right, we're going right into it. The first one that we talked about was because of COVID, we thought that coaches would be safe. They'd get kind of a mulligan just like people did with eligibility this year. That did not happen. So why don't you kind of walk us down memory lane on that one to get us started?
Yeah, no joke. The list of coaches that were fired in 2020, really, it's a longer list than we can go down and even explain. But let's just focus on the SEC. You get Jeremy Pruitt fired at Tennessee. You lose Derek Mason at Vanderbilt. Gus Malzahn gets fired at Auburn. Will Muschamp is let go at South Carolina. I feel like I'm missing one because there were so many. And there were stuff other places too, right? Doc Holliday gets fired at Marshall. Tom Herman gets fired at Texas. All around the country, Kevin Sumlin in Arizona in a Pac-12 that barely played any games. No one was safe. Conferences, even when they didn't have the opportunity to do much, were still letting guys go. And I think it spoke to a lot of things. It spoke to expectations. It spoke to where a program was. I think in some cases, maybe it was deserved. In some cases, we talked a lot going into 2020 that people were not going to understand the concept that when you play only conference opponents, records were going to be a lot lower than normal, right? Every conference has to go 500 on average against itself. That's basic math. And that meant without those 4 out-of-conference games or SEC cupcakes, most teams in the SEC were going to have a losing record. Most teams were, and that was guaranteed going into the season. And I think fans and administrations were nominally okay with it to start with, but that wore off. And I think you've got to balance it. I'm kind of curious your thoughts. To me, there's some like Tom Herman at Texas, which I get. And I think the way that season went and the disappointment compared to expectations, he had to be let go. And then there's other situations like Gus Malzahn at Auburn, which I really don't know that they made a positive upgrade or that firing was realistic to the situation they were in and the expectations you should have had going into the season.
Yeah, I think some of that, though, we talked about a little bit. Coaching fatigue did not get a year off. So if coaching fatigue was bad last year, and the only thing that saved Gus Malzahn was a win against a battered Alabama defense, coaching fatigue really showed up this year, and I don't think it got any better. And they saw the writing on the wall, and some of these other teams did too. Same thing like Sumlin, Arizona. I mean, they were terrible. And I think COVID actually saved Harbaugh in Michigan. I think they were inexcusably bad, and they're our second one. Penn State and Michigan, I'm going to talk about this one for a minute. Penn State and Michigan being as bad as they were, and this is something that people will want to blame on COVID, I think, and I think that the fans want to be a little optimistic, and that's okay, in thinking, okay, look, it was a weird year. We didn't get the proper camps. Things happened, and our teams weren't as good as they needed to be. The problem with that is, with Penn State and Michigan, nobody expected them to win a national championship this year, but come on. Like, Oklahoma was good. Florida was good. Georgia was good. Let's take the top Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State's off the board. The other teams that have this pedigree of expectation of winning at least 10 games in a season, they were almost all there. Maybe Oregon was a little bit disappointed, but they had a ton of opt-outs. So to me, these were coaching failures and maybe a little bit of a canary in the coal mine for a regular, full, healthy season. What do you think about that real quick?
It's really hard to excuse losing 4 and 5 games. And we talked a lot about expectations with Auburn and conferences, but there's a limit to that. And when you've got a losing record and, you got guys like Maryland and Rutgers on the schedule, you shouldn't end up 2 and 4. And not just 2 and 4 for like Michigan's sake. They looked uncompetitive at times at 2-4. I think there's something to be said that all around the country, defenses took a step back in COVID due to lack of tackling and all, and that might be something we talk about later. But I think those two teams, their pedigree is built on defense, and it's built on, pounding the ball first and then trying to find the most explosive offense they can to pair with it. And when that was taken away, given what Michigan and Penn State had at the quarterback position, it became really obvious you're not going to win a lot of games with guys that are talents like McCaffrey or Clifford in terms of arm talent. You're just not going to do it. And I don't think they had any other, there was no plan B. I mean, when the defense wasn't good enough, when the passing attack wasn't good enough, you began to become aware that the pedigree doesn't save you when you've got nothing overly positive. And in Michigan's case, I felt like the morale just collapsed.
Number 3 is LSU, and this is one that we got right. Maybe not to the extent of the badness that LSU had, but we took a lot of flack from LSU fans this offseason, the 2020 offseason, because we said, look, the amount of loss that LSU is incurring is unprecedented. Yes, teams reload, teams might have a little step back after a national championship run, but what they have lost is unprecedented, and you just don't fill that in with new freshmen that are super talented, blah, blah, blah. Turns out that was the case. Now, I think that there's games like early on that may have been COVID related. Like if they play Mississippi State in week 4, after everybody realizes that they didn't have a quarterback on staff that could throw against his own defense, like LSU probably wins that game. But LSU was not a good team relative to who they should have been coming off a national championship season. The bottom fell out, and we got that one right. I'll give you a really quick opportunity to take a victory lap on that because you were the most vocal on Twitter about LSU not being that great and took the most heat from LSU fans and went the furthest against the national media's view on that.
My feeling on that was pretty simple. It was the most NFL draft picks lost by a national title team ever. Ever. It was one of the most senior-laden national title teams in decades, and I felt like they were going to take a significant step back. I did not think they were going to be overly contending for a national title or even a conference title. I also thought there was a potential for them to fall off. I have not been, and have at no point ever been a fan of Ed Orgeron as a coach. I do not think he's a very good organizer. I don't think he handles a program or administration very well. If he has really good coordinators and he can sit there and be a motivator, he can be effective. And that worked really well as an interim. But as I've said a million times, Orgeron will lose you games from January to July. And in a COVID year where there was a lot of chaos and practice schedules were disrupted and you had opt-outs, it really magnified his personal issues and their inability to be coordinated and to put together a coherent team was really obvious. And like Josh Pate talked about it at the beginning of the year, that they didn't even really have a team to start the season. They weren't really in any way ready to field a proper team. And I will say as a snippet, I'll be curious to see how that fixes going forward because right now they're looking at having coordinators on both sides of the ball that have never called plays. And, being that their strength was when they had really high level experienced coordinators, I am really concerned about their hires where they're an up-and-coming guy sounds great, and it's good to have a couple of them like Brady on staff, but it's one thing to pair Brady with an Ensminger so that you've got that experience, and that experience comes into play in practice schedules and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be really interesting to see if they can right that ship and become more organized with a significant loss of experience, even in the coaching ranks.
So you're saying that Orgeron being the only adult in the room scares you a little bit?
Yeah, and when you have to say Orgeron is the only adult in the room, there are a lot of alarm bells that probably should go off, and I'm really concerned about that program.
I will say for LSU fans, I might disagree with you a little bit in terms of this season. I think they bounced back a good bit. Brennan showed me a lot last year that I didn't see in previous seasons from him. I think he's actually going to be maybe the top quarterback in the SEC. Maybe not. Number 4 this is something that we got, and everybody got some right, some wrong. Quarterbacks in the SEC. Now, I was high on Mac Jones coming into the season. You were taking a wait-and-see approach. You and I have always and forever been not high on Kellen Mond, even though he was on a lot of preseason top quarterback in the SEC boards. People had Kyle Trask. Some loved him, some didn't. We felt like he didn't get enough love coming into the season. Nobody saw Matt Corral coming out of anywhere. People were high on Bo Nix. We were not. So I think this year for the SEC, we saw a lot of maybe, like I said, both sides. Things we got wrong, things we got right. Talk about, just kind of how you saw that play out, because this is the one of the 5 that you picked for our list. So I'm going to let you kind of unpack it a little bit.
When you looked at the lists of top quarterbacks in the SEC, something I talked about on Twitter, responded to, was people that were picking Kellen Mond as the first quarterback. I didn't see any way that he was going to be first team all SEC. Or, if they didn't have him, it was Trask. I got Trask. Now, I felt like Trask wasn't even getting enough credit, and I think that proved true. I still don't think Trask gets enough credit for how good he was and is. But, just because Mond was a senior doesn't mean that he was going to be great. He ended up being... Well, you got a guy that plays for 4 years. They generally look like what they have looked like by their senior year. You don't usually have instant turnarounds. I was wait and see on Mac Jones. I thought he was good. I didn't know if he'd be elite. The point there was he was a top 5 quarterback rating guy in 2019. And where you and I disagreed was if he was going to be top 5 or not, because he was top 5 overall QB rating, but in third down QB rating, he was not even in the top 100. And I wasn't sure which one of those was the real Mac Jones. As it turns out, I think the third down issues he had probably were partly due to lack of reps and nerves. And I think a lot of it was due to a scheme that was built on Tagovailoa's ability to make hero throws on third down, tight window RPO throws, whereas Mac Jones is a much more progression-based quarterback. And when they changed that offense, he was a lot more effective. When you go to the rest of the SEC, though, I think is where the chaos comes in. You're right. Matt Corral, not only was Lane Kiffin's offense good, but Corral was extremely explosive and accurate. Now, he's boneheaded, and he'd throw it right into traffic, but he'd throw it where he intended to throw it on a dime every time. I think the Auburn quarterback situation, a lot of people thought Bo Nix was going to take a step forward. Neither one of us saw that happening. And it did not, in fact, happen. I'm not sure how much of that was Malzahn or not, and how much he's held him back as a quarterback. You can point to Stidham to say is a guy that was probably a lot more talented than Malzahn made him look. And then the final one, and I think that I took more heat for this than anything else. I had Georgia picked to lose 3 games because of the quarterback situation when Newman opted out. Obviously, Newman as a Heisman candidate was way off. The Senior Bowl validated the fact that Newman was probably, there's no way in my mind that he didn't opt out in part because he was struggling to keep his job. Newman was a flop at the Senior Bowl, bluntly. Maybe it was due to rust, but he did not look good in practice or in the game. He did not look good. And the rest of the quarterback situation, I thought actually that they got better production out of their walk-on than they wanted to give credit for, right? We talked about that a lot. Like, they had DeJuan Mathis starting at quarterback. He was a disaster. And then Stetson Bennett came in. I thought he played okay. He wasn't great, but he played okay. But what you saw from JT Daniels was a quarterback that was good enough to be consistent enough to move the ball, and all of a sudden you had a 10.3 yard per attempt passer. Stetson Bennett, I think, was better than people gave him credit for. 7.6 yards per attempt was enough to make the offense stable. But a lot of people had Georgia pegged too high because they just really underestimated how much that quarterback situation could hamstring them. So as a whole, I felt like the SEC revolved around the quarterback position, revolved around Miles Brennan being out at LSU. That really torpedoed LSU's season. Mac Jones and Trask turned things around. Georgia and Auburn were sunk by quarterback play. Everywhere you looked, quarterbacks were up or down, and they were up or down to an extreme in a way that I don't think most people understood or anticipated.
Yeah, I mean, and even you talk about Ole Miss and Corral, like, people are talking about Plumlee maybe being the starter And I don't know. Same thing with Mac Jones at Alabama, talking about Bryce Young maybe being the starter there. It was really interesting to see, and it's funny that here we are yet again for so many years, and some of it was fair. SEC was not producing quarterbacks in the NFL, and now it seems like every year they've got multiple first-round draft pick, candidates. The last one that we and everybody maybe didn't miss because they didn't call it out, but were surprised by was the fall of, or maybe mediocrity of, blue blood defenses. Alabama had their struggles this year, though I think they were better than people give credit for. Everybody's so used to Alabama beating people 16-9 10 years ago that when they give up 24 points to Texas A&M, people say they're trash defense or they're not the Alabama defense of old. They're not, but nobody is, because of the offenses in modern era football, at least the elite ones. Ohio State had their struggles. I know Sean Wade wasn't the guy that they expected to be when he had to move to the outside from the slot corner. They didn't have great linebacker play, even though they had, some veterans there. Clemson's defense was not anywhere near what we've seen in the past. Clemson is not a blue blood. Historically, they don't count, but in terms of this conversation, blue blood, really elite teams, their defense struggled. I had to get that caveat out there before people got at me in the comments. Josh, I know you maybe were a little not as high on Alabama's defense as I was, but I think in general, this concept of defenses struggling was a surprise. How much of it, in your opinion, was COVID? How much of it was bad defenses, and how much of it was modern era football?
The answer is always a little bit of everything. Early on in the season, it was a lot of COVID. Defense is about contact and reaction. And the way you become good at defense is by practicing against an offense. You can't mentally scheme how you're going to react to formational shifts. You can't mentally scheme how you're going to react to somebody on a stretch play that you're filling an alley and taking the right angle. That has to be practiced live. And so where an offense gets to dictate the play, and they can do clean reps and throw on air and get really good at what they're doing, defenses need an opposing offense. They need a scout team to become good. With COVID restrictions, it wasn't just limited practice time, which really did hurt them. It was also the fact that most teams limited the exposure of a defense to the offensive players for quarantine reasons. They limited the ability of the players to have contact. They limited off-season workouts between different units, and that all greatly impacted them. But that impacted them early. I think the thing that really was surprising is that they were really bad, and they only got so much better. Like you said, Alabama got to be pretty good. Now, I will say the reason that I'm not quite as high is I feel like they put up a ton of points that would bury their opponent, make them one-dimensional. I mean, Ohio State was moving the ball, especially on the ground on Alabama, before they got in a hole. But like Ohio State, their defense really wasn't great. The defensive line was good. The linebackers like Tuff Borland, again, mentioning the Senior Bowl, kind of got exposed a little bit. The secondary got exposed. Clemson all around defensively wasn't an elite unit. They were good, but no more. And then you had a lot of teams like Florida, that their defense was, pretty much a disaster all season. Oklahoma took a step forward, but took a step forward to being merely good. I didn't see really almost any elite defense. And it was only the teams that were high-level offenses that were left standing at the end of the year, really with the exception of Notre Dame. And you really got the feeling, to be blunt, that Notre Dame was almost standing alone as a good defense that had managed to get to the playoff. And even them, I'm not sure how good they really were because it felt like Alabama toyed with them. So I just didn't think there were any elite defenses. And to have no one even in the playoff have a truly elite high-level defense was a little bit shocking.
I think Georgia and Notre Dame and Cincinnati all had I think Notre Dame's defense was really good. I think that Georgia and Cincinnati had elite defenses. Okay.
Georgia, you have to give the injury caveat because a lot of people only saw Georgia when they had 6 or 7, like the Florida game, they had 6 or 7 starters out or guys out of the two deep. Georgia, the first few weeks of the year when they had, what was it, like 9 returning starters, and they were more talented than anybody in the country, literally anyone on the defensive side of the ball. I would agree with you. That unit was elite, and I hate that we were robbed of that for the remainder of the year because they were never fully healthy.
Yeah, that to me is one thing that's really impressive about the Alabama offense is that they were able to put up 41 points on that Georgia team because that's when the defense was healthy, and that defense, they were good. Here's a question I want you to consider with a really open mind, given that you are on the defenses sucked in 2020 from good teams bandwagon. If we look at the key games from these blue blood teams or elite teams where we have the impression that they had a crappy defense, it's Alabama was Ole Miss and it was Florida. For Clemson, it was Notre Dame and Ohio State. For Ohio State, it was Alabama and Indiana. How much did COVID and timing come into play to maybe unfairly jaundice our view on these defenses? And I'll give you my argument and you can counter it. Alabama gave up 24 to Texas A&M, and at the time everybody thought that was really bad, but they really dominated that game, gave up, I think, a late score, and that was against a good offense. Florida had supposedly been prepping for Alabama for a really long time. I think it's clear that Lane Kiffin had been prepping for Alabama for a very long time and knew every single one of Alabama's keys. Ohio State was prepping for Clemson artificially. I will take this to my grave for a month, I think, in that game. Clemson had a lot of players out for Notre Dame, which was partly COVID, partly injury. So I think that there's an argument to be made that artificially these defenses look bad, that if they played those teams 10 times straight up, they're not giving up 45 to Ole Miss. Clemson's not giving what they gave up to Ohio State. Maybe Ohio State isn't giving up what they gave up to Alabama because they had players out, defensively important players with COVID. So I'm going to let you maybe counter that or maybe even soften your position a little bit on crappy defenses 2020.
I think it depends on which team you're talking about. I do agree with you that situations matter a lot in this discussion. Alabama is probably the most situational because when you look at the teams they struggled with, like you said, Ole Miss, Florida, it turns out those were just really good offenses. But even still, there are times when LSU moved the ball well on them. There are times where Tennessee moved the ball a little bit. Lots of games to 300-plus yards allowed. They really never shut anybody down. And that's when I talk about elite. Usually top 5 teams, there are a couple of them with truly elite defenses that are, they're not ever giving up 4 yards per play. They're holding tons of teams under 300 total yards. That just didn't happen. It really didn't happen. And Alabama is almost the exception. The problems I had with Ohio State and Clemson, you can talk about the games where they gave up a ton, but that Ohio State-Indiana game, 490 yards is a lot. Even like Northwestern, who's a really bad offense, had 4.6 yards per play, 330 yards to over 200 yards passing. Rutgers moved the ball well on Ohio State, 373 yards. Clemson had a number of games where they looked sketchy. I mean, Pitt, they shut them down for 246, but they, a couple weeks prior, Boston College puts up 28 points. Syracuse puts up 21, 325. And those were a lot of games where for about a half the other teams moved the ball well and they just couldn't sustain it. Virginia had 417 yards on Clemson. So there were a lot of smaller games in blips or halves of games where teams moved it well and not a lot of domination at all. And especially like Clemson, if you look at prior years, 2019 or 2018, I mean, I'm looking now. In 2019, Clemson made it until December without giving up 300 yards in a game. So if it seemed weird to you that I was talking about, some of these games like, the Virginia game or the Syracuse game, and it's like, how bad is it, right? 325 yards at Syracuse. Clemson did not give up 300 yards in a game until December in 2019. So that's what an elite defense looks like. I mean, tons of games under 200 yards allowed, and that just didn't happen. So at the high bar, the defense wins championship level stuff didn't happen, and the top level teams didn't have it. Like you said, Georgia maybe could, but I don't think it's just about COVID. These teams were consistently not as good, and even against teams that weren't high-level RPO teams, that weren't high-level offenses, they were still giving up 100, 150 yards a game more than they normally would to that caliber opponent.
All right, y'all, that's our 5 things that everybody either missed or saw. We saw some of it. We didn't. I got homework for y'all. 2 things in the comments. 1, give me your 5 things that you didn't see, or some of the things that you didn't see for the 2020 season that came to fruition. And also, Josh and I are kicking around the idea of doing a video where we can go back multiple years, because frankly, we were pretty good on 2020, even in the preseason. We want to do a video of maybe 5 things that we completely whiffed on, and maybe do a secondary lap on eating crow and those things. So let us know if there's something that we really, really missed out really bad and you'd like to see us eat some crow. Either tweet at us or let us know in the comments. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.